So stress is basically a response of the human body to the demands that is placed on us on a daily basis. It's normally a physiological response, which means that the human body responds to the demands. It can also be psychological, which means our thinking, the way we emote, our feelings and our behaviors can also be representative of the stress that we face. One of the recent findings that we have from neuroscience is about how the human brain is adapting to stress in modern world with globalization, with changes in technology, and with our own ability to understand the human brain, say through methods like the magnetic resonance imaging and so on. We are able to understand how the brain of young people today are responding to stress. If you look at brains of young people, say 20 years before us or 30 years before us, you'd realize that the amount of stimuli that the human brain has to go through is very different from what a young person's brain today is used to. If you take a case of, say, a young person who has to, say, go to college, has to complete his or her studies, he has commitments with friends, perhaps doing another job, involved in social media and so many other activities. If the person has to focus on all of them equally and do well, which most people want to, an additional stress like traffic or an additional stress like pollution can actually make a big difference in their way to adapt, in their ability to adapt to these situations. If you look from a health angle, 30 or 40 years ago, a person who gets a heart attack would be someone in the age of 60 or 70 or even 80. But today, it is not uncommon for us to hear of someone having a cardiac arrest as young as 30, sometimes 25. There is a phenomena in psychology called quarter life crisis. This is a crisis the young people between the age of 20 and 28 go through. They are well established educationally, they have a job, they're probably in a relationship, perhaps going to get married, economically well off, but they do not have the psychological mechanism to face the demands of all these tasks. And one of the areas that is affected is physical health. Once again, stressors like pollution can make a big difference in the health of young people, because the human body is not used to managing these levels of pollution, and so it begins to affect the body, and you get many cases in hospitals and clinics today of cardiac problems, problems related to respiratory infections and so on, and it has a cumulative effect. So you can imagine the kind of demands as they multiply. The ability of the human body to respond to that is not proportionately increasing, and therefore it becomes important for us to devise ways in which we can manage these situations more effectively. It is also known that young people get bored very easily. At the same time, they want to be very inventive and do something with their time. And an added stress of traffic congestion in the city is the fact that there is so much to do, but yet they are stuck in one place and they are not able to move on. And so it really makes sense to devise ways in which we can ease congestion and reduce some of these environmental barriers that can make the lives of young people much better, and so that they can have a better quality of life. Children, as you know, are by nature very anxious about going to school, because school is a big source of stress for them. They are evaluated, they look up to their teachers, there are demands placed by the school system in terms of assignments, homeworks, and so on. Consider the effect that an additional stress can have on a child. Let's look at a child who needs to be in school, say by 8 o'clock in the morning, and so they leave their home by maybe an hour earlier to that. Due to traffic congestion, the child is going to be late. What happens in children's mind always is that they're always thinking about what might go wrong in the future. What if I come to class late? What's my teacher going to say? What's my principal going to say? Am I going to be pulled up for that? And this can actually be a big source of stress for children, to the effect that it can affect their studies, it can affect their emotional well-being. We've had children who come to some of our clinics who are not able to sleep well, who sometimes are so emotionally disturbed that they go through conditions like what we call as enuresis, where they wet their beds at night, and these are children who have actually achieved their developmental milestones already. These are just examples to show how an external stress like traffic can actually affect the lives of young children today. Let's talk about a young professional who has to meet the demands of work. He may be married, he has children at home, a wife or a husband, and so on. Sometimes problems with traffic can delay a young person or a working person reaching home by 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, sometimes 1 hour, and makes a big difference in their family life. You know that if you have children, they always look up to parents coming home on time and spending some quality time with them. And a lot of parents are not able to do that today because rather than being at home with their children and with their spouses, they're stuck in their vehicles on the road, in traffic jams, and that can have effects in their family life. In Bangalore, there are over 5 family courts, and the number of family courts are increasing. And one of the reasons for couples to separate is because they are not able to manage the stress that is associated with their domestic life, which comes from the area of work-life balance. And a lot of people are not able to balance their work and their family life because of external stressors like traffic congestion and so on. So this is a problem, I think, that affects everybody across the lifespan, not just children, not just young people, but even the elderly people. Anyone who is part of a cosmopolitan city like Bangalore is affected by a situation that is caused by heavy congestion and traffic density today. One of the ways in which children cope with any kind of stress is that they think about possibilities which can comfort them. That's a way of coping. Whereas as adults, we are able to rationalize. We can think a little more logically, but children can't. So some of the scenarios that you presented is very true. Sometimes we call it overgeneralization or catastrophic thinking, magnification. We call them thinking viruses or cognitive distortions. That is, we think in a way so that we can feel comforted by that thought. So like you said, if a child who is in a bus is getting late and the child is getting very anxious, so what would an adult do? An adult might pacify himself, think differently, make a telephone call, say I'm coming late. But children can't do any of these things, so they're totally helpless. And they'll be thinking of the consequences. If I reach late, my teacher might get upset with me. And those are actually highly anxiety provoking situations for students. So they might think of other thoughts. They might have magical thinking, like you said, or hope or wish that something will happen to the school. So then their anxiety will reduce. So it is true that children have different ways of coping. For a child to be affected to a great extent, there should be something called a vulnerability. Let's assume there are 5 children and all of them are sitting in this bus and they are going to get late. 2 or 3 of them might be more vulnerable than the others. So the person is vulnerable, maybe for genetic reasons, family reasons, so on and so forth. It is likely that it can affect their thought process. Now, the incidence of psychiatric morbidity peaks in adolescence. Between the age of 13 to 18 is when we have the highest levels of psychiatric morbidity. And today we have a lot of information about why that is so. There's a concept called brain plasticity. It's called neuroplasticity. So the neurons in the brain is like you play with Play-Doh or plasticine. You can keep molding it. So if a child is sitting in a bus, a child is getting tense, and the child is thinking about the worst possible scenario, and let's say the child panics, or the child reaches late and gets a shouting from the school or something like that, experience actually causes the brain to start functioning in a certain way. And that particular neural network gets reinforced in the child. And the child begins to get anxious more often, even for smaller things. So it might get generalized to home, what will my father think, or what will my mother think about me if I fail in this, or what if I don't do this on time. So it starts generalizing and then becomes a part of their thought process. So for a vulnerable child, stressors like this can actually make a big impact lifelong. Well, data like that is very hard to come across. Now, ICMR, Indian Council of Medical Research, did some large-scale surveys, epidemiological research all over India on psychiatric morbidities among children, and the estimates actually vary from the kind of data they have. They have school-based data, they have clinic-based data. School-based data in some cities in India, they have found that children, up to 40% of children can be vulnerable, sometimes even more. A very recent study that was just concluded at NIMHANS, which looked at vulnerability of psychiatric disorders and morbidity, estimates that 10% of children can have some problem at any point of time. So if you translate that into the population of India, they are huge numbers. But vulnerability among children is only going to increase, because the demands that a child is going through on a day-to-day basis is increasing, but the children's potentials are the same, and so the brain vulnerability is only going to increase. It will definitely help, because any environmental manipulation that we do to reduce the stress, the source of the stress, will definitely make the child more resilient and give the child a better quality of life, because you're stopping a potential trigger for stress. And for children, triggers are important. The environment and the triggers in the environment are the sources of stress. It could be geographical, like you said, traffic. It could be a person. But if that is removed from the equation, then their lives can definitely be better. There's no doubt about it. We have a civic responsibility to ensure that children and young people today have better lives. As you know, that India, the total number of young people below the age of 35 is a big number, it's a staggering number, and we need to figure out ways in which we can make life better for them, because they are the future of the country. I think projects like building flyovers that are quick, that can improve the accessibility of persons, will make a big difference in reducing stress that young people go through. A steel flyover is a good idea for a number of reasons. For instance, it can be assembled very quickly, which means that the hardships that the common person has to go through while a regular flyover is made is reduced in multiple folds. Of course, they have much greater longevity, which means that the cost that goes into maintaining them and the time that one can use these flyovers is for several years. And I think as responsible citizens, it's important for us to think about the future, not just of the present, and ensure that the projects that we do are projects that are sustainable and that will actually improve the quality of life of tomorrow's generation.